Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here. It's a real privilege, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me and for that very kind and generous introduction. So, we know that urban inequality is a huge challenge. We've got over half of the world's population living in urban areas. And we have to improve living conditions in cities in order to be able to address some of the biggest kind of social and ecological challenges that societies and populations are facing. Over 1 billion people worldwide live in unplanned or informal settlements with inadequate housing, inadequate sanitation, water, energy, and a lack of kind of core services. The concentration of people living in urban areas is also kind of changing the dynamics of major challenges like climate change. The latest World Cities report focuses on climate action in cities and looks at how the kind of concentration of people living in hazard-prone urban areas means that climate impacts are becoming increasingly urbanized. Cities are projected to get hotter, they're going to become more arid, more humid, depending on the policy responses and emissions in particular places. The SDGs, I think, are really interesting because for the first time, we've got a commitment to look at sustainable cities and communities, but also to look at urban inequality as a universal challenge. So the SDG commitment is to leave no people behind and to leave no places behind. And that is a shift in recognition that urban inequality is not a challenge that only affects cities in the global south, but also, as Roland was just explaining, cities like London, where I do the majority of my work, where it's sometimes difficult to make arguments that the kind of intra-urban inequalities that you see in places like London and other cities are as prominent and as challenging. So urban inequality is a complex, multi-dimensional, relational, dynamic, fluid concept. I don't need to tell you this. But this diagram from the World Cities report published in 2022, I think is quite useful. So it illustrates the multiple relationships between different physical factors, political factors, economic factors that all drive urban inequalities in different ways. And I think for me, it sums up the complexity of what we're dealing with, but it also illustrates the point that we need to think about urban inequality in context. So what's happening in a particular place? Because not all of these relationships will be prevalent or dominant in each city. Each city has its own histories, development trajectories. Some of these things will matter more than others in different places. So being able to explore that in context and to look at all of the different starting points that that we as urban scholars, but also policymakers, practitioners, residents have is important if we're going to be thinking about holistic responses. This diagram I also like because it demonstrates that responses, policy responses, practical responses to urban inequalities need to take account of one or two or three of these different overlapping factors. So understanding those intersections is something that I pay a lot of attention to in the work that I do. Recently, just a few years ago, I had the privilege of being part of a project called Knowledge in Action for Urban Equality. This is an amazingly ambitious project that involved 12 different university and NGO partners working in over 10 cities globally together to ask questions about what is transformative knowledge for action on urban equality. So how can we work in particular locations to understand the dynamics of urban inequality in that place, and to create capacities to produce knowledge together that would be transformative in that context, but also enable us to understand, think about the dynamics of urban inequality more generally, and what might be transferable to other locations. The Urban Institute were one of the organisations, one of the academic institutions that were part of this programme. No really was influenced by thinking about social justice and epistemic justice as really critical elements of scholarship on urban inequality, but also action and responses. So a lot of emphasis was placed on co-production, thinking about mechanisms for the co-production of knowledge, and thinking about then what can be kind of generalized and shared in broader contexts. One of the many outputs from this program is this conceptual framework, I suppose, which sums up the principles of urban and territorial equality that were developed during the KNOW program. So there's 4 different dimensions to it. The first is equal distribution. So this is about equitable access to the things that you need for a dignified life. So income, decent work, health, housing, the kind of things that you would expect, and that actually are the focus of a lot of work on urban inequality. Second was parity of political participation. So this is about having the conditions and the systems and the processes in place that allow citizens to be involved in framing problems, developing knowledge, developing solutions. Sometimes that's through kind of democratic and deliberative processes. Often it's through thinking about participation and co-production. The third dimension is reciprocal recognition. So this is about identities. So thinking about claims to the city, who has the right to certain spaces, who's excluded from those spaces, how we can take account of race, ethnicity, gender, religion, and other categories of identity when we're thinking about urban equality and urban inequality. But the fourth dimension, solidarity and mutual care, I think is really interesting because this is not often seen in conceptual kind of frameworks when we're thinking about responses to urban inequality. But this focus on having the networks, the community-based infrastructure that would allow people to, that would guarantee but also enable people to provide mutual aid and care for each other was something that emerged really strongly through the local networks and projects that were part of the capacity building and the research work. And I think it's a really important dimension of thinking about urban equality and the kinds of cities that we want to design, that we want to design policy for, that we want to create. Part of the KNOW program, so the kind of the latter part of the KNOW program was affected by COVID. So we started off doing fieldwork in person, then the pandemic came along, and we had to continue this global program of work in isolation from each other, we weren't in person contact. And I think this aspect of solidarity and mutual support that had already become really important in the project really came to the fore here. So looking at the responses that the local partners were developing in their own cities as the pandemic developed particular kind of issues in different places. Was really interesting. So I thought I would just share that with you as a general kind of conceptual framework that emerged from that work. And then now I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I do in London, which is about regeneration. So regeneration as a form of urban policy, as a practice, and also as a lived experience. And think a bit about how knowledge about, or how data and knowledge about urban regeneration is created in this context. So urban regeneration, it was really interesting walking here this morning actually to see how much development is going on up the hill from where I was staying that looks very much like a lot of the work that's underway in East London. I think about regeneration as policy practice and lived experience. So that means engaging with a variety of different stakeholders. So thinking about the plan makers and the policy makers who are seeing regeneration and physical transformation and socio-economic transformation as a moment in time when they can imagine different kinds of futures for the city. So those imaginaries of the urban good life are always kind of summed up in different ways in regeneration planning and policy. But the question for me is always, well, whose kind of idea of a good life is it that is represented in those plans, and where are the moments where, thinking back to the framework that we talked about just a moment ago, where are those moments where there's an opportunity for that kind of parity of political participation or voice or solidarity to come through. I've worked probably for about 15 years in East London, so looking at the development of London's Olympic regeneration legacy from when the park was, from when the Olympics were announced, to the development of plans, to now thinking about what it's like to live in this place, and to work with local residents and community organisations to try and understand what the impact of the legacy regeneration has been. So in this context, one of the questions that I keep coming back to in my research, and I find it really interesting, is the question of what counts as data and knowledge and evidence. And that might seem like a really self-evident question, but it's not. Data, evidence, knowledge, they are socially constructed, they are not neutral, there are all kinds of political ideas that underpin the use and kind of deployment of particular concepts or measures at a particular time. And this is what I've been really interested in following through the development process at the Olympic Park. What is it that this vision of the good life is meant to deliver, for who, and how do we understand whether it's been successful? So one of the things that I think about a lot is who's got the power to frame urban policy problems. Because the knowledge that's available to policymakers and decision makers will shape the problems and opportunities that they decide to work on. And many of the forms of knowledge that are used to inform regeneration planning are technocratic, they're held by a small number of experts, they're created by academics and universities or government policymakers in places which are very distant from the individuals and the communities who are being affected by those decisions. And also the credibility and the authority of different kinds of knowledge changes over time. So I'm really interested in understanding what is it that plan makers and policy makers are using at a particular moment in time to make the case for urban regeneration, to make the case for change, and to justify certain decisions, such as the displacement of some communities and the replacement of them with a new population, which is one of the things that's happened in the Olympic Park. And there's a lot has been written about the communities that were in the Olympic Park before the Games, the number of businesses that were displaced in order to make way for this new kind of vision of the good life in East London, and the way that certain forms of evidence were deployed in that process to suggest that the Olympic Park, the Lee Valley before it was the Olympic Park, was empty or a wasteland or underdeveloped. In the work that I do, think tanks, research institutes, networks of individuals who are sometimes in universities, but a lot of the time not, are really active in this space in terms of putting forward particular concepts that have traction at a moment in time. So well-being, social value, thinking about inclusive economy or inclusive growth, community wealth building. These are all concepts that are kind of discussed in the space that I'm working in. And often the language is very fuzzy and it's not always obvious who is advocating for a particular concept at a particular moment in time and why. So the notion of, or the concept of epistemic communities is something that I find quite useful in the work that I do. So epistemic communities are networks of knowledge-producing experts, quite often professionals who've got authoritative claims to policy-relevant knowledge. So this concept was developed by Peter Haas in 1992 in the context of work that was going on in the international policy sphere on sustainability. So it was like who was coming together to advocate for different concepts and to mobilize those concepts at different points in time. And going back to the idea that data and evidence and knowledge seems self-evident, but is actually highly political, the way that particular policy concepts are mobilized by these epistemic networks is something that I find really interesting and have followed quite closely in the Olympic Park over the last 15 years, looking at which kind of concepts have traction and encourage people to act and which don't. So I've just put here an example. So the Club of Rome is a really good example of a kind of long-standing epistemic community, which is a network of states and organizations and individuals, some of whom are academics, some are not, who advocate for particular forms of economic and sustainable political and policy action. Anyway, that is all a very long way of a long kind of introduction to what I find particularly interesting, which is indicators. So a lot of the work that I've done over the last 15 years has been looking specifically at indicators. So who designs indicators, what they're designed for, the kinds of things that are measured by urban policymakers. Indicators, I find, are a particularly powerful form of knowledge in terms of mobilizing action. This applies also to thinking about the way that urban equality, urban inequality is conceptualized and measured globally. But what I'm going to talk about is indicators that are being used in the context of regeneration in London. So this is this is the London Data Store, the Mayor's online data portal. Here are just a few of the indicators and metrics that are used for urban governance. So for thinking about how efficient and productive London as a city is being, but also for action on policy as well. So thinking about where are the hotspots that require interventions in terms of deprivation, climate action, and kind of other concerns. So as I said, indicators function as a technology of government, and it's this kind of power, but apparent kind of objectivity and neutrality that I find particularly interesting. And what I'm going to talk about now is how we have worked with this idea of alternative prosperity metrics to try and bring citizens' voices and lived experience into this space, and some of the work that we've done to think about what impact it has. GDP is obviously a really good example of a super powerful indicator, the world's most powerful number, it's sometimes called. It's not just about kind of recording GDP growth, but it's about bringing together the leaders of the world's largest economies, as measured by GDP, to act as a collective. So thinking then about kind of indicators and success in the context of London's Olympic legacy. So July 2005, London won the bid to host the 2012 Games, specifically on the promise that it would, that legacy regeneration, so not just what happened during that kind of however many days of sporting activity it was, that the benefit of the Games would be felt for local communities specifically for decades to come afterwards. So part of the legacy regeneration promise was that the Games as a catalyst for physical, social and economic transformation would address historic inequalities. So specifically, East London compared to more affluent West London, multiple forms of deprivation, you know, a 200-year history of inequality compared to the more affluent western side of the city. So the promise was that the Games would close the gap in prospects and prosperity between people living in the poorest areas of East London and the wealthiest areas of West London within 20 years of the Games. The question then was, well, what should this look like? How do we kind of measure what this successful regeneration would deliver? So this is a picture of Canary Wharf. So the Olympic Park regeneration was a continuation of a regeneration process that started in London's Docklands when they closed in the 70s. Canary Wharf was developed in the 80s. Highly successful from an economic perspective, very unsuccessful in terms of delivering benefits to the local communities, the kind of deprived and disadvantaged areas around. So thinking about regeneration measures that would be able to articulate this difference of experience was something that we wanted to look like, that we wanted to look at with this particular piece of work. So the key question then was, if the Olympic legacy is about addressing inequalities, if it's about delivering on a new vision of a good life and a prosperous life for communities in East London, well, what should that look like? So we worked with a group of citizen scientists. So citizen scientists are members of the public who work with academics. Oops, wrong way. You might be familiar with things like the big butterfly counts or the Zoe app that were developed in COVID. So these are kind of classic citizen science projects where scientists design or identify a research problem, design a research program, and then invite members of the public to contribute. Most of the time it's on a voluntary basis, and often they're counting or mapping different kinds of activities that then feed into wider scientific studies. What we are doing in the Olympic Park is something called citizen social science. So what we're trying to do is rebalance that relationship. So citizens are part of the research team from the very beginning. So talking to that issue that I mentioned earlier about who gets to frame an urban policy problem, thinking about fair and ethical practice all the way through that relationship. So making sure that people are compensated and trained and have an equal voice in the research process. So this is what we wanted to do, this is what we have done with this work in the Olympic Park, to come up with alternative prosperity measures. I don't have time to go through all the background of it today, but it was based on a really in-depth qualitative research program that was run first in 2015 and then again a couple of years later, asking the questions, what is a good life for you? What are the obstacles? And what are the things that support prosperity in East London? Because we wanted to get an understanding of those intersections between different aspects of people's everyday lives. If you want to know more about the qualitative work that underpins the metrics that I'm going to talk about, the London Prosperity Board website has got lots of resources. Many of them have been produced by the citizen scientists themselves, so you can hear their stories of what it's like to live in the neighbourhoods in East London where we're working. So what changes when citizens define prosperity? So GDP is the kind of dominant proxy for prosperity in global discourse. It's about income, it's about wealth, and what you can see here is that the key change when citizens define prosperity is that you get to a multi-dimensional notion of what it means to live a good life. So there are 5 different domains of prosperity that people identified, and the foundations being the one at the building block at the very bottom, without which they just, cannot flourish or thrive in other areas of their lives. And at the very bottom of the foundations brick is the idea of livelihood security. So this is something that has come out consistently in the research that we've been doing in East London over the last 10 years. That a secure livelihood is not just about having a job, it's not just about having income, it's about a kind of overlapping set of assets and resources and services that people need and rely on. And if they don't have them in their everyday lives, they really struggle. So what difference does it make? Was it last year? Yeah, last year we did a piece of work looking at comparing the citizen prosperity metrics. So, the determinants of prosperity and ways of measuring prosperity as local people identified to the initial convergence framework. So these were the initial indicators that were used to measure the impact of the Olympic legacy. So what you can see on the left-hand side is a table that looks at some of the metrics that were used to measure the economic impact of the Olympic Games. And here things look pretty good. Population growth has increased, employment growth has increased, business growth has increased, and resident earnings growth have all increased. So these are some of the initial metrics that were used by the mayor, by the GLA, to assess legacy impact. What you can see on the right-hand side is that prosperity model that was designed by the citizen scientists that reflects all of the different determinants of prosperity. We turned that into an index based on a survey of 4,000 households in East London to look at how different areas are doing, with a distinction between understanding what's going on in established neighbourhoods and going on in the new regenerated areas that've got new housing, new population. And you can't see all of the detail of it, but you can see there's very different patterns. So there's quite extreme variation in terms of people's livelihood security, in terms of their experience, depending on where they are living in East London. And this work also flagged up issues, inequalities around gender and race and ethnicity and age. So it tells a very different story, essentially. So the conventional metrics say things are looking good, and the citizen-led metrics, citizen-led perspective on inequalities give a much more nuanced and detailed picture, which is important for understanding inequalities, but also for thinking about concrete action. So we've got very specific insights about different kinds of pathways and different policy responses from this new kind of evidence, citizen-led evidence. And this is just a different way of presenting that data. So this map looks at livelihood insecurity, so that foundation of prosperity across the Olympic boroughs. So the kind of pale patch in the middle is the Olympic Park that is being redeveloped. And you can see the very dark blue areas around. So these are neighbourhoods that are at risk of multiple forms of livelihood insecurity, using that definition of livelihood insecurity that citizens came up with themselves. So it's based on lived experience. So it's quite a different picture of successful regeneration when you look at it through their experience. So looking ahead then, I wanted to just share some thoughts and reflections on new forms of inequality, new dynamics in urban inequality. So things that I've been thinking about quite a bit recently. There are two projects that I've been involved in over the last couple of years that have really made me think a lot about data. One of those was with Newham Council, so one of the East London boroughs, developing something called a data citizenship kind of concept. So thinking about what is it that people need as individuals who may or may not be connected, to the internet, may or may not have the kind of the skills to access public services which are all moving online. What is it they need in order to kind of function in this data-rich world? And it's a really interesting idea because a lot of policy focus in this area is on understanding digital exclusion, getting people online, training them with skills to code so that they can potentially be able to work in this new, in the new kind of jobs that are being created in data and digital sectors. But this piece of work was thinking about citizenship in a different way. So it's like, what is it that data should be doing for communities and for societies? And what is it people need to understand about their data, the data that they might need access to, the data that corporations, for the most part, are extracting from them, harvesting and monetizing. What is it they need to understand in this world? So that was one project. And then I was involved in another project with Camden Council. And this was focused on, so working with data scientists. And I think it's important to say I'm not a data scientist. I'm not an AI expert. I don't understand algorithms, but I was the anthropologist on the team who were looking at whether administrative data that is held by government could be used to measure community well-being. So the kind of starting point for this project was, for the most part, public sector policymakers use survey data, self-report survey data. So they will ask us, how do you feel about your health? How do you feel about your well-being? But administrative data is the kind of routine data that is collected about us all the time, every day. So it's about, if you are a member of a sports club, your local authority might have information about how often you go. If you go to the library, they will know what kind of books you borrow, council tax, rent payments. So there's this whole world of administrative data that government is sitting on, but doesn't really know what to do with. So this then prompted me to think about who is visible in these data sources. So you will all be familiar with, the critique of AI and its inability to identify women and people of colour because of the data sets that it's being trained on. So this issue about administrative data was interesting because it's part of this public sector government efficiency discourse. So going back to what I was saying about how public policy problems are framed, here is a framing of a public policy problem, that the public sector needs to be efficient, doesn't have much money, it can't afford to keep collecting survey data, so why don't we work with AI and administrative data sources as alternatives in order to save money and be more efficient. But obviously, if you are not visible as an individual because you're not using those services, or you're not participating, or you don't have full citizenship, you're going to be excluded. So this opens up a whole new space of potential inequalities in the knowledge that's being used by decision makers. Just a couple more points and then I will finish. The other thing that I've also heard a lot about in this kind of dialogue about efficiency and discourse is the idea of synthetic research participants. So this is a screen grab from a company that is a commercial company, so it's focusing on kind of design research, basically, user research. I'm not aware of this happening in the public sector yet, but the idea that you can do synthetic research, user research without users, by coming up with models and kind of AI agents who can simulate participants and simulate different kinds of responses. So this again goes back to the point about if you're not in those data sets, you're not going to be represented. So who are the synthetic participants going to be when this kind of research is being done in the public sector about urban inequality, about poverty, about exclusion from space? I don't have the answer, but I think it's really interesting to look at, because this is a space that is moving very fast, and it's a space that is primarily being driven by commercial organisations. So I think one of the big challenges for us, for you as urban scholars, is how to keep pace with that change. When we've got data and AI and these digital services being an absolutely kind of essential part of our everyday lives, how do we think about them? So this is a really interesting paper. It's a critique in urban studies on the rise of AI urbanism in post-smart cities. So two quite interesting concepts being discussed there. So it's basically a kind of, setting out what is different, how is AI urbanism different from smart city urbanism, and it poses some critical questions. But nowhere in this paper is there a discussion of social justice. And I'm very aware that in the administrative data project that I was working on, in other kind of policy and private sector conversations about data, there's a lot of discussion about ethics. So who owns data? How do you get consent from people to use their data? But there's very little, if any, attention given to questions about social justice. What are the kind of impacts of these applications? So my question to you is, where is social justice in this world of digital twins and simulations? And I think the other point that I wanted to just end with is this article is kind of carving out a new intellectual space by saying, well, let's have AI urbanism. We've had digital urbanism, we've had smart cities, let's have AI urbanism. But actually, I think because these are such essential aspects of urban life, does it make sense to silo them into different urbanisms? How is that going to help us address these questions of inequality? I will leave you with that question. Thank you.